In a quaint neighborhood nestled amidst a bustling city, there stood a cozy little house at the end of a quiet street. This house belonged to Mrs. Thompson, a kind-hearted elderly woman whose warm smile and gentle demeanor had become a beacon of light for those around her. Mrs. Thompson had lived in her house for decades, tending to her colorful garden and spreading joy to anyone who crossed her path. Her days were filled with simple pleasures like reading books on her porch swing and baking delicious treats for neighbors and friends. One sunny afternoon, as Mrs. Thompson strolled towards the nearby park, her eyes caught sight of a young boy sitting forlornly on a bench. His clothes were worn and tattered, and his eyes carried a weight far beyond his years. Mrs. Thompson's heart immediately went out to him, and she approached him with a kind smile. "Hello, dear," she said softly. "What's troubling you on such a beautiful day?" The boy looked up, startled by her kindness, but something in Mrs. Thompson's gentle demeanor put him at ease. He wiped away a stray tear and replied, "I'm hungry, and I don't have anyone to play with. Everyone says I'm a bad boy." Mrs. Thompson's heart sank at the boy's words. Without hesitation, she sat down beside him and offered him a comforting hand. "You're not a bad boy," she assured him. "Sometimes we all just need a little kindness and understanding. Would you like to come to my house? I have some cookies and milk, and we can play in my garden." The boy hesitated at first, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. But the warmth of Mrs. Thompson's smile and the genuine concern in her eyes won him over. He nodded slowly, and together they walked hand in hand towards Mrs. Thompson's cozy home. As they entered the welcoming atmosphere of her house, the boy's eyes widened at the sight of the colorful garden outside the window and the tantalizing aroma of freshly baked cookies wafting through the air. Mrs. Thompson led him to the kitchen table and served him a plate of cookies and a glass of cold milk. The boy's hunger was soon replaced by a sense of comfort and belonging as he savored the delicious treats and listened to Mrs. Thompson's stories of her own childhood adventures. She shared tales of playing in the same garden he now admired, of chasing butterflies, and imagining grand adventures in the world beyond. As the afternoon sun painted golden hues across the sky, the boy's heart felt lighter than it had in a long time. He laughed and played in the garden, forgetting his worries and embracing the simple joy of the moment. Mrs. Thompson watched him with a twinkle in her eyes, her own heart warmed by the innocence and resilience of youth. After some time, as the shadows grew longer and the day began to wane, the boy turned to Mrs. Thompson with a grateful smile. "Thank you for being so kind to me," he said softly. "I'm sorry for being a bad boy." Mrs. Thompson shook her head gently. "You're not a bad boy, dear," she replied. "You're just a young soul learning to navigate a big world. And remember, no act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever wasted." She then packed a small bag of cookies for the boy to take home, along with a piece of her heart. As he bid her goodbye and walked down the quiet street towards his own home, Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment and gratitude. Little did she know, her act of kindness would have a ripple effect far beyond what she could imagine. The next day, as Mrs. Thompson tended to her garden, she heard a cheerful voice calling out to her. It was the boy from the park, his face beaming with excitement. "Mrs. Thompson," he exclaimed, running towards her, "I brought you these flowers from my garden. Thank you for being my friend." Tears welled up in Mrs. Thompson's eyes as she accepted the flowers, a symbol of the blossoming friendship between them. From that day on, the boy would often visit Mrs. Thompson, helping her with chores and spending time with her in the garden. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, a testament to the power of kindness and compassion in bridging the gap between generations. The boy learned valuable lessons from Mrs. Thompson: the importance of empathy, the beauty of nature, and the joy of giving back. Months turned into years, and as the boy grew older, he carried with him the memories of Mrs. Thompson's kindness and wisdom. He became a beacon of light in his own right, spreading positivity and helping those in need, just as Mrs. Thompson had done for him. And so, in a world often filled with chaos and uncertainty, the story of Mrs. Thompson and the lost boy became a reminder that kindness knows no boundaries, and that a single act of compassion can create a ripple of positivity that touches hearts and changes lives.